Dr. Kurtzer mentioned the idea of stakeholders, and that's what our next topic is about. American Jews, Israeli Jews being stakeholders in the same future. And we're going to hear two very interesting perspectives. The American perspective will be shared by Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer. Daniel Kurtzer is the S. Daniel Abraham Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. During a 29-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service, Ambassador Kurtzer served as the United States Ambassador to Israel and as the United States Ambassador to Egypt. Ambassador Kurtzer currently serves as a member of the Secretary of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board and is the co-author of numerous books about peace in the Middle East. So he'll be sharing the American perspective on how Americans see Israel, or see Israelis, and then to share the perspective on how Israelis see Americans, we have Dr. Einat Wilf, who is a senior fellow with the Jewish People Policy Institute and the Bay Foundation Adjunct Fellow at the Washington Institute. Dr. Wilf served in the 18th Knesset as chair of the Education, Culture, and Sports Committee, chaired the subcommittee for the relations of Israel with world Jewish communities, and is a member of the influential Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. Previously, Dr. Wilf served as foreign policy advisor to Vice Prime Minister Shimon Peres and strategic consultant with McKinsey and Company. So please welcome them to the stage.
Good afternoon. If you are wondering, Yehuda is my son, and he's a very hard act to follow, but I'll try my best. I want to shape my comments today around two vignettes that might suggest some avenues that we could converse about later today. One of them occurred at Princeton in May when we held a conference on U.S.-Israeli relations, and we invited to that conference an author who had just published a book about the U.S.-Israeli relationship. That author described an American Jewish community that was largely fractured by concerns relating to Israeli policies in the occupied territories, policies with respect to religious freedom, policies with respect to human rights. Later in the day, an Israeli, General Yaakov Amidror, a veteran of the Israeli army, former national security advisor in the Israeli government, stood up to talk about Iran, but prefaced his remarks by suggesting that, in fact, the author of the book on American-Israeli relations was wrong. And what General Amidror said was, American Jews are not so much concerned about Israeli policy. What they are effectively shtadlanim. They are court Jews who want to curry favor with members of the larger community. And since American policy largely disagrees with Israel on questions relating to the future of the West Bank, the future of the Israel-Palestine dispute, American Jews have become the proverbial court Jews. This generated, as you can imagine, a rather significant debate at that conference. Second vignette. A few years ago, as part of an ongoing dialogue within Israel involving rabbis in the settlements, I was invited to one of those meetings. They wanted to meet an American former official who was Jewish and who had maintained a connection to the State of Israel. And I happened to fit that descriptor. We sat for a meeting, my wife and I, and my daughter-in-law, in fact, sat for a meeting with them. And the question that consistently arose during what turned out to be about 3 hours was whether or not my primary loyalty was to the United States or to the State of Israel. I tried to explain that as an American citizen, my primary loyalty would be to my country, but that thankfully and blessedly, there was no contradiction in also being a Zionist, a person who is extraordinarily proud that after 2,000 years of exile, we have recreated our homeland. We have a strong and vibrant Israel. And that this question of loyalty really harkened back to an other time, a time in which one had to make a choice between loyalties. During the course of 3 hours, that question repeated itself, and the rabbis could not accept an answer in which I was not prepared to say that my primary loyalty was to the state of Israel. Now, I start this way in order to be a little bit provocative, and I'm sure Einat will, in a sense, reflect some of the alternative other views on the other side, but also to suggest that the problems that Yehuda noted in his remarks earlier are more than just philosophical. They are exceedingly practical in day-to-day life, both in the United States and in Israel. We value, for example, in our communal life, the kind of pluralism, the kind of openness, the kind of acceptance in which there is this, what do we used to call it, the large tent. And we don't understand why that same large tent does not exist in Israel. In fact, a speaker at a conference some time ago suggested that the real paradox here is that American Jews, who are a minority in a non-Jewish state, have a greater sense of security and self-confidence with respect to who they are than Israelis, who are a majority and, thankfully, a very strong military, strong power. And so we are confronted with these sets of paradoxes, some of those which Yehuda enunciated, others that we know about with respect to differences of view that we have over questions of religious observance, basic identity, not just the basic identity of who is a Jew, but the question of who decides who is a Jew. And we're left with this unanswered and perhaps unanswerable conundrum in which these two societies that do feel bonds, whether it's family bonds or the bonds of a mutual ancestor, however you answer the question that was posed earlier, we haven't yet decided how we can resolve these problems. And even when some progress is made on one issue or another, women's prayer at the Western Wall, the backlash within Israel takes us 2 steps backwards before we can see progress made. The additional factor that comes into play is the political divide. Not just the practical issues that divide us, but the politics that divide us. Back in 2008, then Senator Barack Obama gained about 78% of the vote in the American Jewish community. And for the next 4 years, he and Prime Minister Netanyahu, as you know, engaged in a head-to-head battle over issues relating to settlements in the West Bank, occupation practices, and commitment to the search for peace in the Middle East. In the subsequent election of 2012, Obama gained nearly 70% of the Jewish vote. In other words, notwithstanding the very strongly held views of the Israeli government And notwithstanding some actions with which we are familiar, in which the Prime Minister of Israel sought to argue for his policies over the head or behind the back of the American president, American Jews still overwhelmingly voted for the Democratic candidate for president, the incumbent. And one can only imagine, one doesn't know what will happen on November 8th, but we've now experienced during these past 4 years an even more divisive debate between the United States and Israel over the Iran nuclear accord. And yet the polls suggest that American Jews will continue to vote on the basis of economics, governance, social issues, domestic politics, and by and large, by a majority, will not vote for the candidate who proclaims to be more pro-Israel with respect to this argument about Iran. And so we have a practical divide, and we have a significant political divide. And that political divide and that practical divide account for much of the immediacy of what Yehuda was describing more philosophically and generically as the divisions within our family. Now, it's not impossible to deal with these issues. In fact, the overused word conversation is probably a good way to start. Today is a good place and time to start. Because one can think in practical and pragmatic ways of methodologies and processes for dealing with some of these issues that may not resolve the larger question of who we are and how we relate to each other, but can begin to regulate our relationships. Let me give you some examples. Start with the question of where is the dividing line in terms of input and responsibility for Israeli policy. Now, this is an easy question to answer. On questions relating to war and peace, on questions relating to economic and social issues affecting the citizens of Israel, these are decisions for Israelis to make, Israeli Jews and other Israeli citizens. We may have a view on these issues, and so you will see a plethora of op-eds from Americans who work on the peace process, suggesting ways that the peace process can be advanced. But at the end of the day, none of us who do this have any suggestion that we can dictate or that we have a vote in how Israel decides. So that's a fairly easy set of issues. What about issues relating to the Jewishness of the State of Israel, Jewish identity? Here the problem is not as clear-cut. And here the problem becomes one which forms one of the core arguments within the American Jewish community. Because some in Israel have sought to determine unilaterally, as a matter of Israeli policy, issues that affect Judaism and things Jewish outside of Israel. Basic identity questions of who is a Jew. Questions relating to personal status, marriage, divorce. Questions relating to conversion, the acceptance of others into our community. And American Jews have said almost uniformly that these are not issues that can remain simply within the purview of the chief rabbinate of the State of Israel. For sure, that chief rabbinate has something to say. as do other streams of Judaism within Israel. But equally, we have something to say, whether we are Orthodox, conservative, Reform, non-denominational, whatever our inclinations are. Questions relating to Judaism and basic Jewish life have to be shared responsibilities. In fact, even on some issues within Israel itself, Israel might be well advised to pay a little more attention to what American Jews have to say. We have, for example, a long and largely proud history of involvement in civil and minority rights within this country. We've been subjected to anti-Semitism. We still are. We've largely overcome it. And we have reached out our hands to help others who have felt the scourge of hatred and discrimination. So how we think about these issues and strategies and tactics for dealing with them might be something that, in fact, Israeli Jews can at least study, if not actually adopt. There is no dividing line on some of the large questions that Yehuda noted. On the zero-sum questions or the black and white questions of whether or not Israel's survival, well-being, its success should be open to debate. There is no debate on those questions, nor should there be. There should be no debate on questions of the love of Jews for Jews. However we relate to our sisters and brothers in Israel, the fact is that we do have a special responsibility, as they have a special responsibility to each other. Arevim ze lazeh. One way to advance our understanding of how to deal with these practical issues is to begin shedding old stereotypes. Going back to the vignette that I cited at the outset, we need Israeli Jews to stop thinking of us as gullus Jews, as shtadlanim, somehow believing in shlilat hagolah, in the denial or diminution of life outside of Israel. Israelis have to stop expecting to judge our leaders on the basis of their kishkas. And you know what I mean. But let me go beyond the plain meaning. Because if you analyze our presidents on a kishka scale, I would suggest that Bill Clinton and George W. Bush come out pretty high. If you analyze our presidents on the basis of who actually did something that helped advance the security and well-being of the state of Israel, Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush come out pretty high. So kishkas matter in a Shabbat cholent. I'm not sure they matter much in determining whether our president is trying to help Israel advance its security and well-being. In a sense, and in conclusion, even though it's Yehuda's job, I will cite his colleague and boss, Daniel Hartman, who has suggested over the years that it's about time all of us, both in Israel and outside of Israel, stop thinking in terms of extremes, of exile or redemption, galut or geula. Because in fact, as several have said today, we're in a kind of golden age in which we thrive in Israel and in which we thrive in the United States. And so we do need a new set of understandings of how these two communities relate to each other, both philosophically and perhaps in some of the ways I've suggested, practically and politically. Thank you very much.
You're starting to ask questions on the app. It's wonderful. Thank you. We're going to first hear from Einat Wilf before we take all the questions at the end. So let's welcome her to the stage.
So thank you for the opportunity to be here today. It's truly wonderful. I must say, just to share with you, I arrived here this morning after a 15-hour flight on the new direct line between Tel Aviv and San Francisco. Yay. And it was one of the most amusing experiences in my life. I think the plane was almost exclusively populated by men in their 30s and 40s with laptops writing code for much of the flight. So this was my arriving here. So my answer, as an Israeli born and bred, to the question of this panel, should we be equal stakeholders, is a resounding yes. But that's far from being a typical Israeli answer, which is absolutely no / I don't care. Now, I can tell you a little bit about why I care and why my answer has become a resounding yes. So when I was 16, I was sent by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs on this kind of, it's called Young Ambassadors Delegation. Sarah, you mentioned that Israel is not a normal country. This is, you would say, a heroic, some would say a pathetic effort on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to convince teenagers around the world that Israel is normal. So we sent teenagers from Israel to show teenagers around the world that we're just like them. And mostly we spoke to non-Jewish audiences. We went in pairs. But once in a while, we went in the afternoons to speak to Jewish audiences. And I was in upstate New York, February, very cold. And we did a little spiel about how cool Israel is, and this is the music we're listening and all that. And the time came for Q&A. So one guy asks a question and says, okay, we've heard everything you had to say about Israel. What's the best thing we can do for Israel? Now, I'm a product of the Israeli Mamlachti education system, really quite the product of it. My answer is very clear. Make Aliyah. I didn't know about the understanding with Ben Gurion. So there's a silence. The guy, quite courageous, raises his hand again. What's the second best thing we can do for Israel? Now, this for me was a shocking moment. Growing up in Israel, the answer was obvious. How could anyone even challenge how obvious the question, the answer to the question was? And this really began a lifelong journey for me. I can share with you another shocking moment for me in this journey. A few years later, I visited the Holocaust Museum on the Mall in DC. I arrived at the last room after all kind of the harrowing rooms that led up to it. And in the last room, there's a nice little framed picture of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. It's kind of in the corner, very sweet. And then pictures of the Statue of Liberty, of New York. And I'm thinking, really? You grow up in Israel on the story of Shoah v'Tkuma, the Holocaust, and then the rise in the establishment of the State of Israel. It leads from one to the other. The Holocaust ends with the creation of Israel. It does not end in a condo on Fifth Avenue. But here it was. Those were the images. And they told a very different story from the one that I was raised on. And it was not just those moments. My entire life was beginning to change. This was the 90s. I was growing up into the 90s in Israel. Israel began to open up. I remember the first time we had a chocolate in the supermarket that was not elite. It was suddenly the markets were opening, things were possible. We flew more and more. Over time, communications became cheap. Some of you still remember the time when if someone was abroad and you made a phone call to Israel, it was like very quickly talking. It was so expensive. I went to study in the US. I spent 6 years as an adult. During those years, was I a yoredet? When I came back, was I an olah? Did these labels even mean anything anymore in the world that I was growing up into that began to just feel much more fluid? It didn't seem that we were now making decisions for our entire lives. It used to be thought that if someone was making aliyah to Israel, the parents would go with their child at the airport crying, waving a white handkerchief. Who knows when they'll see their child again? Well, now they land and it's Skype and everyone sees each other and you're flying back and forth. So are we really, does it really make sense to judge each other, the communities, in terms that no longer reflect our lives? And I began to think that we need to have another way of relating to each other. The old structure seemed to just no longer reflect the life that at least I was living. And if I were to describe the old paradigm, and I think I would not be making too much of a caricature of it, it pretty much said this. From the Israeli perspective, if you want to be a good Jew, you need to make aliyah. If you did not make aliyah, you need to give money, a lot, and feel very guilty about not having made aliyah. Those are your options. And I think I'm not too exaggerating. And in that was a bit of the pay up and shut up kind of agreement. And I felt that that didn't make sense anymore. I thought we can do away with a lot of the judgment and the should. And I thought, okay, how about if we had this new way of thinking about our relationship? If the old kind of judgmental attitude said all Jews should live in Israel as a matter of should, a new framework would say that Israel should be the first or second home of every Jew in the world. Now, by second home, I don't mean that you should go and buy expensive real estate in Israel. It's really not helpful at this time. But in this era, we can have a meaningful long-distance relationship with the country, with its people. We can make, even if we don't live in Israel for all our lives, if it's not the center of where we live, we can still have a lifelong, meaningful relationship with the country and its people. And there are so many ways of making this happen, from ensuring that whatever your profession is, you're a teacher, make sure you find a school in Israel to affiliate yourself with. You're a doctor, do the same with a hospital. You're a lawyer, find a firm. Find ways to make Israel part of your professional life. Make sure that Israel is a place that you regularly visit, maybe spend extended time in. I want to say something also about Hebrew. I used to think that it's unimportant. English is the lingua franca of the Jewish people today. Fine. And I figured that's okay, we can live with it. But then since I'm from Israel, I have another country which I kind of half made into my second home, and that's France. I love France. So I once went to France to improve my French. It was a month-long program in a beautiful small village in the French Riviera. And every day we would wake up to 8 hours of studying French, looking over the magnificent view. And I thought, why can't Hebrew be taught in the same way in Israel? We are clearly over the era where we take airplanes in the middle of the night, whisking Jews into safety. They land, we send them to 6 months of Ulpan, and then they become part of Israeli society. People now move in and out. Can't we find perhaps programs that are 2 weeks in Eilat, in the Sea of Galilee, in the beach of Tel Aviv? Because a language is a home. You want to make Israel your second home? A language helps. So I've actually become a proponent of Hebrew for all, but in a new way. So I think we can begin to build that new kind of relationship. Because we live in a world that if you offer people 0 or 1, all too often they will choose 0. But if you offer them a spectrum of possibility, they'll find something that fits them in the midst. But it's not just about for the individuals. This makes a difference for Israel and the Jewish people. When we are all part of this, we have a better Israel and we have a better Jewish people. I give a lot of talks in Israel to incoming delegations that come to Israel for the first time. Anything from business people in Africa to Hispanic mayors in the US to business people from China and Japan. And I very often give the introductory talk of what is the Jewish state? What does it mean? And I go through the various ways of being Jewish. I always mention that I'm a devout atheist, to where I see many people, when they hear for the first time in their lives of a Jewish atheist, they begin, like, you see the kind of the wheels rolling and trying to figure out. And I go through what it means to be Jewish from a Neturei Karta to a devout atheist such as myself, and the various ways of thinking about being Jewish, and the various visions of Israel as a Jewish state that come from the different ways of being Jewish. And then I tell them this. I tell them, look, I will give you a definition of the Jewish state. And I promise you that it will be the definition to end all definitions. And I tell them this. The Jewish state is the one state in the world where we get to argue about what it means to be the Jewish state. And I basically tell them, look, this is, in my view, an accurate definition of what Israel and Zionism have been from day one. An ongoing debate of what it means. And we are, in many ways, united in that heated debate and argument, and in our competing visions. And by the way, I mentioned, and this is why Israel's a democracy, not because we had some Greek-minded founding fathers. Israel is a democracy because we have no choice. We have no pope. We have no one to arbitrate our arguments. So the only mechanism that we have to argue is parliament and democracy. But if each one of us could impose their vision of the Jewish state on the other, I'm not sure we would be a democracy. But in the meantime, we're arguing. So if we think of ourselves as stakeholders in that future, all Jews being equal in that, then we make a better Israel and a better Jewish people because we have a richer argument. I can tell you that as an Israeli coming to the US, I was fascinated by the various ways of being Jewish in the US, coming literally from a place where Judaism is black and white. That was something. It gave me a sense of freedom that we can innovate in Judaism and make it form it to our will. I brought a lot of that back to Israel with me. The feeling that no one can tell me what Judaism is, that I am equal to any rabbi. I can tell you, I said that in the Knesset many times. People didn't like it. That I'm equal to any rabbi, and many times I said as an elected member of parliament, perhaps even more, have a right to say something about the big questions. Who's a Jew, who's in, who's out, and why? We have a much better and richer conversation. But I think it even matters more, not just to Jewish people in Israel. I do think that why be a part of the conversation, why be a part of the argument? I do say that in this day and age, still today, Israel is the most fascinating project the Jewish people have undertaken. And I can tell you, as a kid growing up, I complained to my parents, you dried up all the swamps already, you won all the wars, how boring it is for us by now. But there is a sense of a remarkable project, and if people seek meaning in their lives, and they do, this is still one of the most amazing ways to have meaning in your life as a Jewish person. But I want to argue that it even has greater meaning for the world at large. We are now struggling to understand a universal vision of the world and a tribal sense. In that sense, family matters. America today has a universalist president that is inspiring in so many ways. But in so many ways, it means that there is a blindness to the need of people for tribe, community, a sense of something that is yours, and that, to the extreme, you are killing and willing to be killed for. And as progressive sensibilities look at the Middle East, but seriously today, much of the world, they say, really? In the 21st century, you are willing to kill and be killed for tribe, sect, religion, ethnicity? We're post that. The American president had once chided Putin for living in the 19th century. And I was thinking, actually, most of the world lives in the 19th century. And we cannot just choose one or the other. We need to be able to have a world that has a universal vision, but very much has a place and understanding for the need of people to have a tribe. And I know that in so many places, especially on the West Coast, people almost say, really? No, 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 we're all the same. No, 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 my tribe, your tribe. But when we say that, we're blind to basic realities and needs of humanity. And that blindness is dangerous. So if we, as the Jewish people, can create an argument that includes Jews and non-Jews, but is an argument about how to be a tribe and how to be universalist, that will make for a far better state of Israel, that will make for a far better Jewish people, and we might actually contribute something to a key struggle and question in the world today. Thank you.
So we've been receiving your questions. It's wonderful, and we welcome Ambassador Kurtzer back to the stage for some discussion. We have some terrific questions from the audience. Thank you, and continue to please send them in, and as they're coming in, we'll look at them and we may ask. So the first question is a tough one, and it's probably one many of you are wondering too. Sometimes it's one that I struggle with, and it is being anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic the same thing?
For the last 10 years, I've been on a college campus, and unfortunately, these issues have become conflated. Alliances have been built on some of our campuses in which criticism of Israeli policy, legitimate criticism of Israeli policy, has been labeled by the pro-Israel community as anti-Semitic, and then you end up with a very vicious cycle, because you end up with the people who are critical of policy translating that into a view about Jews generally. I think there is a dividing line that it's hard to maintain between American Jewish and non-Jewish criticism of Israeli policy and anti-Semitism. I think it's a very hard line to hew, and unfortunately on many of our college campuses, including at Princeton, it has become a reality that these issues have become conflated.
So there's a long and proud tradition of anti-Zionism that is not anti-Semitic, going back to the Bund, socialism, Natura Carta with their theological anti-Zionism. So there is a way of being anti-Zionist that is truly part of a real debate about what is the proper response to the question, indeed, of enlightenment and emancipation. But this is not what we're seeing. What we're seeing now is something that Alan Johnson from the UK has called the rise of anti-Semitic anti-Zionism. And that you would recognize. It is what we have discovered is a respectable way of being anti-Semitic. Very few people allow themselves, certainly not in academia or in respectable circles, to be anti-Semitic the old way. That is, at least now, not acceptable. So the new way of being acceptably anti-Semitic is this rise of anti-Semitic anti-Zionism. And I can tell you that it is very clear to notice when you see it, because there is a certain emotion there, a certain virulence that just policies don't get out of people. And when you see that emotion in people, you have to wonder, is it really that you care so much about policy, or is there really just something behind it? And sadly, more and more what I find is that it is an ancient hatred mutated into respectable form.
Thank you both for those answers. Someone asks, what do you say to American Jews who want to have a strong relationship with Israel, but can't condone the policies of Prime Minister Netanyahu or Defense Minister Lieberman?
Well, look, the reality is, and without this being an advertisement for any groups, there are now very Zionistic American groups that allow people to express different views with respect to Israeli policy. The Israeli Policy Forum, J Street, other groups that have coalesced around the idea of different Israeli policies. It is possible to be pro-peace and pro-Israel. And that doesn't necessarily mean that if you are arguing for certain Israeli policies that you need to find yourself labeled somehow as anti-Zionist or as a not suggested conflating the two. So there are a lot of avenues now for American Jews and non-Jews to express views about the conflict. As I mentioned in my remarks, the ultimate decisions with respect to war and peace will and should rest in the hands of the Israeli government. But we can have views and express those views through avenues that continue to allow us to be pro-Israel and Zionistic.
So I'm very much in favor of engagement with Israel and Israelis, and Israel is such a political society, and I can assure you there are few Israelis in Israel who do not support Netanyahu and Lieberman, and there are a lot of ways of engaging with them, and with friendship groups and part of political effort, and I'm all in favor. I want to say something about the groups in America. such, for example, as J Street. When J Street started, I had quite a few conversations with Jeremy. And I told him the following: look, I have no problem with your policies. They are policies, they are what I support. Many Israelis support them. But I would like to see two things in your organization. The first, that nothing you do can imply or mean that you think that the Israelis don't know what they're doing or they don't know what's good for them. That I find personally offensive, and I think this should be very clear that you draw the line there. And the second is that you cannot kind of turn away and kind of turn a blind eye from people who under your tent and in your name promote ideas and policies that between them and being pro-Israel, there's no connection. Obviously, I was a failure, but I do think these are two good and not very onerous parameters to how we can conduct a very powerful argument without it turning into something that I think is far more problematic.
Okay. Our last question. My biggest challenge is how to keep my kids Jews in the United States. We are not religious. I love the idea of Israel as my first or second home, writes this questioner, and I think it's a great topic.
Look, I think Einat is right. If we adopt this idea of Israel being your first home because you decide on Aliyah, or a second home because you decide to remain here, but have that kind of connection both physically by visiting often or studying, learning the language, I think that's great. For us in the United States, however, there has always been one answer to this question, and that is education. There is no substitute to educating our children, both in our tradition, and I don't use the word religious values because it may be a non-religious education, but our Jewish tradition, which would include a heavy dose of why it is that we are so proud of the state of Israel. Without education, we don't give our children a choice. We expect them at age 18 or 21 or 22 to make choices, but unless they have had the background of coping with these issues and grappling with these issues, I think it's an impossible demand to make of our kids.
So I've outlined some of the ideas, but I really think in addition to education, it would be great if you all had an Israel plan for your children, thinking what you do with them that includes Israel at various parts and points as they grow up, so it does become natural, so it does become part of their lives, and then they can begin to forge that relationship themselves. Certainly, as someone who is very not religious, I do think that whether living in Israel or connecting with Israel or making Israel second home still offers the absolute best answer to how to be not religious, but have a very deep sense of caring and being part of the Jewish people.
Thank you both for taking these questions and for your remarks earlier.